morning, good afternoon, good evening, whatever time it is. Hello, everyone. It is I, Tim, the brand weaver, and you are listening to Branding for Breweries, or you might be watching Branding for Breweries, which is equally awesome. Thank you so much for sharing a bit of time with us today. And today it's going to be epic. I am talking to advanced Cicerone, cider guide, beer judge, and all-round epic guy with epic beard, Josh Lindsay. I'm going to bring him onto the stage now, and we're going to get stuck in to how you can turn a great beard, I'm talking about beards too much, a great beer award into a great brand. Everyone, welcome to the stage, Mr. Josh.
Well, howdy, Tim. Hey, that's an epic intro. I hope I can live up to those expectations.
I'm sure we can, dude. We were talking before this, and we were vibing, so it's all good.
Yeah. Really looking forward to talking with you this morning here in Indianapolis, and yeah, man, working with your audience.
Wicked. So Josh, this show is all about taking your experience as a beer judge, but then trying to help our audience and understand, well, winning an award is one thing, but how do you then leverage that to promote your brewery, to grow your brand? But I suppose before we do that, maybe you could give us a little bit of background about yourself so people go, all right, Josh has got chops. I'll listen to him for 30 minutes.
Yeah, no, I'll give you the kind of the quick, short and dirty version. I started brewing when I was 17. I picked up a Mr. Beer homebrew kit, found a little hack in the system where you could buy all the ingredients. You just couldn't buy the finished product. Made some really crappy beer fermenting under my bed. Thankfully, I can still see, which is great. Got busted by my parents and thought it was going to be the end of that. And my dad actually thought it was pretty cool. So I got to come out of the shadows and do a little homebrewing. Thought I, knew it all. Realized very quickly that I didn't. Especially once I got to the opportunity. I went to the University of Colorado in Boulder, where there was essentially a brewery on every corner. The Brewers Association, the trade group here in the United States, is based out of there. So just a great brewing culture. Got to spend some time at Oscar Blues there in Longmont, and it really got bit by the craft beer bug, whether it was, the imbibing of the liquid or the people that I was able to kind of interact with, or just the passion that I saw from both brewers and consumers. It stuck with me. And so when I graduated from Colorado and my parents stopped paying my rent, I moved back down to Texas, where it was a little more affordable, and found myself hanging out at Karbach Brewing Company down in Houston, kind of treating it like my own backyard. And before I knew it, they were like, hey, you're here a lot. Why don't you just join the team? And so joined as a marketing assistant and was doing events and activations. And again, thought I knew it all, thought I had it all. And the more I got into it, the more I realized I didn't know. And so I got to kind of spend a great 6 years with Karbach, moving into frontline sales, moving into a brewery education role, working on beer history, beer science across all pillars of the industry, doing a little trade marketing. And then I found myself doing some consulting, and along the way started judging beer, started studying beer, went through the Cicerone journey, and then said, hey, there's other beverages than beer. Let's look at cider. Let's look at cheese. Let's look at wine. And next thing I knew, I just started collecting opportunities to go and learn and imbibe, I guess, and have somehow made a career doing it. So really excited to bring that background in education, and share what I've learned.
Dude. Yeah, so you've kind of touched all points along the way, right? You just kind of got this wonderful history and repertoire of beer, and like you say, cider, cheese, wine. Can't complain. Like I say that I found my ikigai with like branding and breweries, and I'm doing okay at it. So it definitely sounds like you've done the same. But let's get stuck in, my man. What people want to know is, with your vast knowledge of beer judging, what separates an award-winning beer in your mind from the rest? Because there's got to be hundreds and thousands out there, but what makes an award winner?
Yeah, I think the primer to that is, just a little peek behind the curtain on how judging works, right? So when we're judging, we're sitting down at a table, we're given these 7-ounce cups with, about 3 ounces of beer. And the only identifiers we have are what we can physically see with our eyes and a 4-digit number in most cases. So you really are hyper in tune to what is in the glass, both from a visual as well as an aroma, a taste, a mouthfeel, and then a finish standpoint. So there's not a whole lot to hide behind. And so I think, what really makes award-winning beer stand out are the ones that can pass through, some pretty intense scrutiny. I think oftentimes in the beginning, kind of the squeaky wheel gets the grease. And so the things that kind of stick out, whether it's a really good thing or a really bad thing, kind of start to the flight or position in flight starts to take shape pretty early. If you're looking at an American lager category where you're looking for brilliant clarity and you see a beer that's hazy, that's already moving down. So every little thing really is part of that. So I think, the ones that really start to rise to the top are the ones that check all the boxes for the style. At the end of the day, I always say when you're entering beer, you have the rubric that we're grading you on. So you can kind of grade your beer in advance. The answers to the test. And so if you're checking all the boxes for the style, that's always going to get you towards the top. If the beer is cohesive, it all kind of comes together. It's a pleasant experience from a visual to a tasting. And then, quaffability. There's always the saying at the table where it's like, I'd have a pint of this, or I'd have a glass of this, or I want some more of that. And those tend to kind of rise through. That's not to say that, there probably is a little bit of bias there, but ultimately it's all truly being referenced to whatever guidelines are available for that competition.
And this is the thing I think is fascinating about award-winning beer, because it's blind. Like you say, there's only a cup and a number. The whole idea of branding and narrative and everything I preach, it goes out the window. Like, there's purely quality. But there's so many arguments where they're like, well, it's always subjective. It depends what judges you get on the day. But does that start to teeter out? Like when you get like a bunch of cicerones on a table, like their palates are aligned, or do you get that level of flux?
Yeah, I think the beauty of well-run competitions, especially a lot of the professional ones that I've been lucky enough to be invited to and participate in, is there's a diversity at the table, which is valuable, right? Like, my palate is not the end all be all. My opinion is not the end all be all, despite what I may think some days. And to your point, like, I have bad days. There's nights where I party a little too hard, and the next morning we're judging, and we try to put a professional demeanor on and not have anything jeopardized. But there's all kinds of things that happen. My coffee was burned, and so that has an impact. But ultimately, I think what happens is, a little more peek behind the curtain beyond just the individual is oftentimes you're judging with additional judges. It can be anywhere from one other person to three, and sometimes like medal winning rounds at GABF. You have 6 opinions, 6 deserving judges at the table, and everyone really gets an opportunity to kind of share where they're coming from. And it's always rooted in fact. We try to take out, well, I just really like this. That's not really something I ever want to hear at the table, because ultimately it's how is this executed? And so I think when you get that group of people, and it's not just cicerones, I think that's the beauty of it. It's professional brewers, it's sometimes media people, it's sensory professionals, it's all these different perspectives that really allow, like, if you can come to a cohesive decision, you can feel pretty good that that beer has gone through its paces, and it's not just one person saying, well, I really like this, so let's give it a medal.
Yeah. Okay. So you've got the meeting of minds, you've got the levels that you pass through, which gives it more of an even and a fair treatment. That makes sense.
And there's some spirited debate. There's definitely some times where, there's one or two holdouts that really want to defend, and, we try not to die on any hills, and it's not personal, right? We all just want to see the best beer win. And I think that anybody who's entering a competition can feel good about that, because there's definitely been some intense conversations. And to your point, we know nothing about these beers other than what we've experienced. And so when someone's that passionate about what's in front of them, you tend to try to listen while also making sure that you're keeping everything in mind as well.
I got to know, like, have you ever had a beer that is so distinct you're like, I know what that is, I know whose that is? Like, does it have such a distinct marker where you're like, yeah, this cannot be anyone but this brewery?
Yeah, there's situations where that can happen, and I think as a judge, it's our job to not let those thoughts creep in, both from trying to identify beers. Like, it's something I don't even think about. Like, I just throw it out of my brain. I always say my tasting brain is very different than my drinking brain. In my tasting brain, I'm really just trying to evaluate what's in the glass. But there's definitely times where I may have a thought, or somebody who uses really unique ingredients. Like, I was judging a competition in Texas, and there was a ube pina colada inspired smoothie, sour, something or another, and I had flown in, so I wasn't familiar with it, but I was telling somebody after the competition, like, yeah, I had this really kind of wild beer. They're like, I know exactly who that was. And so, because again, how many people are brewing ube pina colada beers? So I will say the short answer to your question is yes, that does happen. But as a judge, really, we need to try to push that out. And if you truly feel like I know this beer, often you'll recuse yourself and say, hey, look, I can't do this flight. I have a conflict of interest. And so at the end of the day, for the sanctity of the competition, I'm going to recuse myself. And there's a lot of background. You have got to share who you've worked with, who you work for, all of these things to try to make sure that your beers are something that you could have unfair advantage doesn't end up, in front of you.
Oh, that's cool. I'm really peeking behind the curtain, Josh. I like this stuff.
Yeah,
And
well,
we
I like
will.
to share this stuff too, because I think a lot of times people don't realize the logistics behind it. And there's a
Yeah.
lot that goes on to making sure that these competitions are, fair and impactful.
So we're going to get onto the branding and marketing side of this very, very soon. But the other question I want to know about the general beer judging world is like, what are some of the biggest mistakes? Some of the faux pas where you're just like, if you're going to enter, don't do that. Don't try and do that. Like,
No, that is my favorite question, because I think that's where people can save themselves a lot of money in knowing kind of the biggest mistakes. I think number one is the wrong category. The beer style that you put on your can is often marketing. So just because you call something a Bock doesn't mean that you should go enter it into the Bock beer category. I've got a great example. We had a beer that we called a Bock. We were looking at the guidelines. It wasn't going to fit there. We started looking at American Amber. We started looking at Irish Red. And really, it kind of, when you look at the guidelines, it fit into Irish Red. And so we're like, okay, do we want to enter our Bock beer in the Irish Red category? Is that too much, how the sausage is made? And ultimately, we decided not to do it. But really, that's what you should be doing. Don't take the liquid that you have and how you brand it and just enter it into competition. Like I said, you have the guidelines. Read it and make sure that it makes sense. Because oftentimes, I've had excellent beers that I'm reading the guidelines, I'm tasting the beer, there's a massive disconnect. And unfortunately, that beer just doesn't get a chance because it's in the wrong place. So I think that's the big one. And then the other one I always like to advise people on is, in some categories, you have the ability to add description or key ingredients, notes, additional information that would be informational for the judge, whether it's, a type of barrel that was used or adjuncts or things like that. And I think oftentimes people use that as like a marketing opportunity to the judges. And I think that often hurts them. If you, obviously, if there's allergens and things like that, you should really declare your ingredients. But if you tell me on the label that there's vanilla in this and I don't taste vanilla, that's going to be a knock. Or if you say ultra rare barrel, the most amazing thing, so hard to get, like now you're building up hype that like the beer is never going to live up to. And so again, that starts to kind of to move things down. So I would say, again, the biggest mistakes, just that wrong category. Don't let marketing drive your competition entries, and making sure that your description is short, concise, only the necessary information so that we can have an accurate depiction of what the beer should be.
It's almost like beer judging is like just anti-branding and marketing, isn't it? It's just like, yep, I don't care what you put on the can. Don't try and make it fancy in the description. Like, just give me the bare bones.
Well, and I think that's what I love about this conversation too, is like, this is the behind the scenes, but then there is a moment where marketing gets to kind of pick up, especially when you get to bring home the hardware, and that's where the marketing shines. But yeah, behind the curtain, it's a very black and white binary world. And so understanding that will enable you to be successful.
Yeah. And the reference you made to like submitting the beer into the wrong category based on what the can said. Have there been any breweries who have then submitted it into a different category to what's on the can, and then they've almost had to like backpedal and change what they've labeled the beer as because there's confusion? Or does it not happen like that?
I've seen that, but I think brewers get in our own heads. The average consumer doesn't know what most of these styles are. I've been on record saying I don't think beer styles were ever meant for consumers. When you go back to Michael Jackson, the beer writer, not the singer, and when
he wasn't in the brewing world, right?
Yeah, started chronicling beer styles, like really the whole evolution of like style as we know it today was to be able to put beers side by side to evaluate them, right? So it's interesting that beer styles, as they're written, have made it into the consumer world, because if you go read any of the beer style guidelines, the verbiage, the lexicon is not consumer friendly. So I think the thing is, like, there's a great example. St. Arnold down in Houston, they do an Oktoberfest and they enter it as old ale, and it wins quite a bit, but they still call it an Oktoberfest because at the end of the day, one, the consumer doesn't know what an old ale is, or I think it's actually a Scotch ale that they enter it in. But one, the consumer doesn't really know what that is. And two, they really don't care, because at the end of the day, if you see a Scotch ale on the shelf, you're not going to buy it if it's next to an Oktoberfest, because you can reference that. So again, I think, beer styles, when they're consumer facing, it should give you a general idea of what to expect, but it doesn't have to be, to a T what it looks like compared to the beer judge certification program or the Brewers Association style guidelines or the camera style guidelines. there's a balance there. And I think there's a marketing style and there's a liquid quality style.
Okay. Right, let's get into the meat and potatoes of it, because like we are saying offline, I've just come back from BeerX, which is a conference here in the UK. There's an awards evening, so it's the SEBRA Awards, Society of Independent Brewers. And so we've got loads of award winners here in the UK. They picked up various categories and the judging went on live there. So shout out to anyone who was involved, and indeed the judges in there as well. But now is the time they need that wonderful assistance of going, I've got the hardware, I've got a shiny thing, I've got a sticker. In your mind, Josh, what are the next steps? What do you need to do with that award?
Yeah, I think there's 3 really simple things that you need to do. 1, you need to promote that you won. You got to tell people. You got to go out there. You got to promote it. You got to sing it from the rooftops, put it on social, hang it up in your tap room. Like, really, any opportunity, go get some earned media, pitch stories to local news, get on TV. Like, there's all these people looking for stories. And so, any opportunity that you have to talk about winning this thing, you should do, because ultimately, like, that promotion is a big thing. And it's a small window where it really gets to kind of be broadcast, because there's always going to be another competition. So promote it early and often. And then the next thing I think you need to do in combination with that promotion is educate. We as professionals, or in industry people, we understand what these things mean. But again, kind of what I was saying earlier, the average consumer has no idea. They don't know what goes into judging. They don't know what these competitions are. We use a lot of acronyms and jargon and things like that. So talk about, what the competition is, what the beer style is, how you got there. Like, really use this as an opportunity to bring the consumers along with you, or anybody who's going to come in contact with that promotion, to share how big of a deal this is. Because oftentimes, for brewers, it can be the pinnacle of a career to go and bring home hardware from some of these, really renowned competitions. But even some of the most loyal craft beer consumers may not even know that exists. So promote, educate, and then celebrate. That's the best thing that you can do. You have to bring the feeling of walking across that stage or having your name called out. You've got to bring that to the consumers and to everybody around you, because that radiance is what's going to build this thing up. So have a celebration at the tap room, have a celebration at some of your best on-premise accounts, have a celebration at retail, do a tour of brewers talking. Like, there's all these things you can do. But I think if you break it down into promote, educate, and celebrate, that's going to be the best way to capitalize. And again, this is just a part of that beer story. So don't make it everything, but utilize this as a really unique opportunity to kind of scream it from the rafters, because you don't always get that opportunity.
I love that, because I've seen a lot of people do phase 1, which is the promote, but actually the educate. Like, dude, I never thought about that, because you've got some followers going, oh, they got an award and that's cool, don't worry about it. But
I got a trophy in my 5th grade soccer team, like, that's cool, like, but they don't realize how big of a deal it is. Hey, there was 18,000 beers in this competition. We bested all of this, and this competition is this, and all of these things. Like, now people are like, oh, I'm bought in. Like, this is awesome.
Yeah, because that hypes the beer up even more, right?
Absolutely.
I suppose then, so that's kind of the 3-step phase, which I love it. What about with the product, with the liquid itself? Like, how do you, are you adjusting? Are you going to shout about? You're going to do like some kind of promo for buy the award-winning beer? Like, anything to drive the sales side?
Yeah, I think, that's a challenge that a lot of brewers face. And you've got to know your consumers. Like, if you have very craft centric consumers and you're doing a lot of unique styles, like, I always laugh, like the Roush beer category is one that, I'm a big believer in Roush beer. I absolutely love it, but it can be pretty polarizing for a lot of people. And so I'm part of This Week is Roush Beer on Facebook. And it's always fun when because that's the most loyal consumers. And when that medal gets announced, like, everybody goes out and seeks them out. And so it's like, but they know that. And so, like, they're able to connect with those consumers. So I think the thing is, like, when you win these, you have that early phase, but then how do you continue to push it through? And I think branding is part of it, right? I've got a buddy down in Houston, Tom Painter. I'll give a shout out to him at No Label Brewing. Every time they win a medal, they change the can art and they add the medal to the side of the can. And again, it's an opportunity to kind of showcase, one, this thing has proven itself, in competition, but 2, it's also, I use this term called sneak teaching, where it's like you're teaching people that these things exist without them really realizing it. And so when they're looking at the can, they're like, oh, what's this? And now they're Googling it, and now they kind of get it. So, I think being able to kind of capitalize on that early stage and then continue through and just showcase, like this thing has gone through the paces and is being celebrated. But I also think there's something to be said about a judge's palate or a professional's palate, where, again, like I said earlier, I'm not the end all be all. I think all judges are not the end all be all. And our palates are also not the average consumer's palate. And so I think you've got to find the balance to utilize this, knowing your audience, how much do you push? But I think you can bring it back to kind of another concept I've talked about a lot, which is CBFR. It's how I like to describe beer to consumers and really retailers and everybody, but it stands for color, body, flavor, and romance. And I think, if you can break down what the beer looks like, what it entails, whether it's high carbonation, heavy mouthfeel, things like that, the basic flavor. And then if you can hit it with the romance, that brings it all together. And I think these awards are part of that romance, just as much as where the name came from and things like that. So I think it's a touch point, but if you just try to make everything about winning a medal, you're not going to connect with the consumer.
I love the romance aspect, dude. That's strong. So,
Yeah.
so you're talking, well, we touched on like sticking it on the can or sticking it on the bottle. And as a consumer myself, I see like a gold label and it goes award winning. I'm like, okay, cool. This has got like some authority in the industry. But in your mind, like, what's the acceptable lifespan of an award? Because I know breweries who dine out on it and they go back to like 2012 for winning or even early. And I'm just like, yeah, but stuff's changed. Like that might not be the case now. Like, what's your take?
Yeah, I think, own your lane, right? And if that, winning a medal 20 years ago is something that you're still, just as proud of today as you were 20 years ago, I think there's value in that. But yeah, I think it's, how big is it on your label? Maybe it does start to shrink, or maybe it moves off the label to the sell sheet, or maybe it moves to a brand book that exists when we talk about trivia of a brand, but isn't forward leading. So, I like to think, the year that you have the award until the next competition, that's a fair cycle to really kind of be stoked. It's kind of like winning a national championship. You're the national champion until you're not. Mm-hmm. And then if you go repeat, now you get to have twice the celebration. So, maybe there's something to be said about that. But, and I think you hit a good point where like things do change. These styles have changed. The way that we talk about them, the way that they're written in the brand guidelines have changed. So, I think use it to your advantage. And if you think it's still relevant, then I'm not going to tell you to take it off. But I think also, you get to a point where you're beating a dead horse. And so it's like, people are like, I've heard about this same thing. That medal says 2005, it's 2025. Like, go do something with this brand. So, I think it's a case-by-case basis, which is kind of a cop-out answer, I'll say. But I think, whatever works for you.
And there must be a difference, right, between having one label that said one in 2005 versus going from 2005 right up to 2025. There's a history of award winning versus we got lucky once because we were pretty cool.
Yeah.
All right. So what I want to know, because it must happen, right? Award winning beers, smash it with the judges, but for some reason it doesn't connect with the drinkers and the end consumer. What's going on there? Why do they fail to connect?
Yeah, again, I think, if we think about how consumers drink beer, they go to what they like, but how do they get there? How do you get them in that first sip? And I think that's the biggest challenge that all brewers are dealing with right now. And so again, I think branding is a big part. You can have an excellent beer, but if your branding is stuck in the 1800s or the early 2000s, it's not going to be that shiny thing on the shelf, and you may not get that initial pull. And so then, the consumer doesn't even get a chance to try the beer, or doesn't even give it a chance. I guess they have the chance if they were to pick it up, but there's so many other things that their brain is trying to process that they don't even grab it. So that branding is a big part. You can't just have great beer. That's kind of table stakes these days. You've got to also have the full suite, which I think, Tim, you're a great resource for, how do you get that time and attention at the shelf to get people to pull it up? And then I think, positioning, right? How are you positioning this brand? Again, let's say you've got, the award-winning, best bidder. I know that's a popular style, but, how does that translate, right? Like, are you positioning that beer as like, oh, this is just the best bidder, or you are the best bidder, or are you positioning it as, this is a great beer for this opportunity, or, here's how we would use this, kind of tie it to actual moments when people would be seeking that out, because now they're like, they've got this connection point. They're looking at a menu. They're like, oh, I'm about to have fish and chips. this is the best bidder for fish and chips, and it's an award winner. Like, let me throw that in, and now I'm going to have it. So you're just trying to tie anchors in people's mind, almost subliminally, so where when they see it, they're like, boom, I got it. And so that's that positioning. And then, the occasions, right? Like, just because you're the gold medal winning, sour pastry glitter bomb, doesn't mean that that's always the beer that everybody's going to drink at every occasion. So tie again, like where that works, when you should be having that, because believe me, there's some amazing beers that are excellent in 1 to 2 ounces and will win an award. But, you try to pour a pint of it, or you try to have it, as a breakfast beer, and it's not going to work. So you've got to kind of take the medal and the award and the great liquid and figure out where else that fits in people's lives. Because for the most part, people aren't just looking at a list of medal winning beers and going and seeking them out. That may be part of the decision-making process, but it's definitely not number one.
Dude, I do wish that was easier to do though here in the UK. Like we've got the awards, and I'm just like, I want to go online and click buy all, and so I can have my own thing. If anyone's listening who can make that happen and send me a link, please do. But anyway, that was a side point. Is it possible that actually winning an award can then isolate a brewery or give them a reputation for a certain style when potentially they have a focus on something else? So maybe, like you say, this is really kind of ambiguous or not very well known style, but they're like, yeah, but actually we're really good at doing these things as well.
Yeah, I think it's possible. I think the thing is, like, I think when people are entering competition and where you're looking at it, obviously you're going into it because you feel good about the liquid that you're producing, and you want it to be showcased, right? You want an opportunity to put it up against others. Well, maybe there's a couple of reasons that people compete, but I think the thing is, like, if you feel like you have a good liquid that represents a style and you put it in, that's fair. But I don't think anyone's looking at, like these ambiguous beer styles and be like, oh, I didn't know this brewery did this. Like, I'm not going to go there anymore. I think it's like at the end of the day, like, if you can make a good beer in any style, those techniques, like that's going to translate elsewhere. In a lot of cases, there is some uniqueness to it. Like if you're just crushing lagers and then, you try to take those brewing practices to double IPA, for example, it may not always translate. Granted, now we got double cold IPA, so maybe it does translate more than we thought. But anyway, I wouldn't be worried about pigeonholing yourself. And I think there's also, there's plenty of brewers who, for lack of better terms, game the system. Like I know when we were entering competition, we look at how many entries were in each category over the last 3 years. Oh, here's a category that's only had 20 entries. Yeah, okay, maybe I can make a good one of those and go bring home some hardware. Like, because I'm only competing against 20 people versus, double IPA has 480 entries. My odds of winning are a lot smaller. And so yeah, I think there's some of that too. But anytime you win a medal, you can promote it, you can brand it, but you should always celebrate your team, because your team is what made it happen. And I wouldn't be afraid of going and winning medals in something you're not known for, because I really don't think anybody would know if you didn't talk about it. And you should talk about it even if you're not known for it, because it just shows that you can make badass beer and it gets represented.
Yeah, I was just trying to think on, like, I'm playing devil's advocate today during this chat, but like to the consumer, if like this brewery goes and like, yeah, we smashed it, we won an award for this, and everyone's like, you've never created that before. What's that all about? We've never even heard of it. Like, is that a good thing? I suppose you can promote it as a good thing. It's like, we can lay our hands to anything and check us out. We win an award.
Yeah, we're diverse, right? Like we can do these different things. Like we're exploring, we're never settling. I think there's ways that you can kind of angle it. I've definitely been in the crowd, especially with brewers when they're announcing awards and somebody will win an award. They're like, I've never even heard of that. Well-known brewers are like, I didn't even know that beer existed, So again, I think that's, some brewers, gaming the system or trying something new. Blue Moon here in the United States is a great example. They won a gold medal for their hazy pale ale. Nobody even knew that they were brewing hop forward beer. They're known for, wheat beer, fruited wheat beer. And so they win this gold medal for pale ale. And then it was 2 years before they actually got it to market. So like they were just kind of getting some feedback and was able to make it work. So, you never know. It could be, you win a medal and now you find a lane and now you have another stream that you can capitalize on. And I think there's value in that.
Yeah. Just before we carry on, Christina has just chimed in from LinkedIn. It's like, Josh is my favorite beer guy. So
if you want, Christina's joining in. Actually, Christina is one of the people who brought me into the beer industry, gave me a chance, and I'm forever grateful for her. She's taught me a lot about this industry as well. So she's a wonderful beer gal herself.
Sharing the love on the Branding for Breweries podcast, my man. Okay, so what about there's got to be breweries out there who are anti awards. Do you get those kind of guys and girls where they're just like, no, we don't want to be part of it, we're not having it? What's the mindset behind that?
Yeah, I think anytime you put yourself out there, there's an opportunity to not win, right? And so, I think there's people who they make great beer, they don't feel like they need to go justify it to, a table of 6, 8 judges, and so they just don't play the game. And at the end of the day, it is a game, right? Like there's a lot of things that have to work. There is luck involved. Competitions today are a lot more of a packaging competition in some cases because everybody's making excellent beer. So the reality is, if you've got too much, I won't nerd out too much, but too much dissolved oxygen in your package, and your beer comes across as oxidized, like that's going to be a hit. And that's usually a packaging thing. I'm sure when you put it in the package, it was excellent. And then through time and transportation, things like that, it got beat up. So I think there's a lot of brewers who just don't want to take the time and attention or don't have really any reason to want to go and justify what they're doing through a competition. And I also think there's plenty of brewers that like don't brew to style, and that's totally fine. Like there's excellent beer that like lives in between beer styles, and that doesn't mean it's not a great beer. It just means it's not going to do well in competition. And I always try to remind brewers, like, we don't brew beer for competition. We brew beer to be consumed. And in competition, 2 ounces isn't really consumption, So if you're making excellent things and, you feel like you're doing what you want to do and your consumers are gravitating towards it, you don't need awards to prove that what you're doing is right. And I think there's some really excellent brewers that kind of take that mindset. And I think that's okay. I think there's a time and place to compete, and it's not for everybody. And I think it's just like competitive and rec sports, not everybody wants to go win a trophy, and there's nothing wrong with that.
No, and as I think about it more, that even in itself is a way to position your brand, which is like, I care so much about the product that I don't want it compromised, and judged under these variable criteria or whatever it is. It's like, there's always a way, instead of you just coming off and sounding like a grumpy brewer, how you can actually reflect your passion for the trade and why you're avoiding it, I suppose.
Yeah, and that's not to say that there's not grumpy brewers. There definitely are, right? There's
not listening to this show, Josh. Everyone is a sunbeam lollipop kind of brewer here, dude. Okay, so win the award, obviously promote, educate, celebrate. It's an amazing structure to follow. But if they want to use that award to position their brewery kind of like premium luxury award winning, what else do they need to do around the edges to achieve that, Josh?
Yeah, I think it's bringing everybody in the fold, right? It's making sure that your team knows what this award is. There's so many times where, you'll go and you're like, hey, I've been at tap rooms and it's like, hey, I saw you won a medal for this beer. What can you tell me about it? And they're like, we won a medal? And it's like, yeah, that's why I'm here, just to try this beer, And so again, making sure that your team knows about it, right? And like building that culture, like if that's truly what you want to be, is, you want to go scream from the rooftops that, you've collected all this hardware, build the culture around that. I think sometimes, there's brewers who get passionate about winning awards, or sometimes there's marketing teams that get passionate about winning awards when the rest of the team isn't kind of bought in. And so it's bringing everybody along that journey and figuring out where it's relevant. And then, yeah, I mean, if that's truly what you want to be known for, is making world-class, medal winning beer, it should be in everything you do. It should be in your branding. It should be visible in your tap room. It should be visible in your education with your staff and the things that they're educating their consumers on. Your retailers should know it. Your account should know it. Like anybody who could come in contact with that liquid should know it. And I think there's a lot of ways that you can share that, whether it's packaging, whether it's sell sheets, whether it's posters, and just kind of really promoting that. And there's brands that's how they build, is they just continue to win medals, and that's awesome. But I will say that I believe that's the minority. I think, oftentimes, like if you can get a couple medals in your career, you've done some pretty incredible stuff. And but that being said, there is definitely brewers who, Tanya Cornett, good friend of mine, she was at Tin Barrel for a long time, and she started Tiny House out of there, and they were a medal factory. They won. I think she's the winningest brewer in the world. But a lot of those beers, like, they were only brewed for competition. It was small batch, and they never really got to see the light to the extent that I think maybe we all would have liked. So brewing for competition is just different. It's I wouldn't encourage anybody to do just for competition. I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That's fair and sound advice. So let's think about some of the brewers out there, or the brewery owners, and they're a small team, 2 or 3 people, and they've not entered an award before, and they're kind of going, maybe now's our time. We need to find an award. We need to submit. What would your advice be for those first timers? Like, where do they begin?
Yeah, two things there. I think the first thing that you should do before you even think about, entering a beer is you should evaluate it yourself. You should sit down with a glass, no branding, and just really write down what's in the glass. What does it look like? Break it down into the AATMF: appearance, aroma, taste, mouthfeel, finish, and really be honest with yourself. Like, don't go into your branding, don't go into your true to target, don't go into any of that. Just break the beer down and then compare that to the guidelines and figure out where you want to enter it. I think that's kind of the first thing is, again, a lot of brewers, talking about those mistakes, will just enter for the sake of entering. Oh, we call it this, so I'm going to put it there. And that's a big no-no. And you end up just throwing money away. And the feedback that you get back isn't helpful because it says wrong style. You're like, okay, cool. So where do I go from there? So again, I think be honest with yourself. And then the other thing I would say is, if you're thinking about entering your beer in competition, you should be enabling and encouraging yourself or your staff to get into judging. It's a very approachable thing. You don't have to be a super taster. I actually hate that term. I think the people who invented that term actually hate the term as well, because it doesn't mean what a lot of people think. But tasting is like flexing a muscle, or building a muscle. Anybody can be an excellent taster. You just have to go through the reps. And so if you want to get into competition, you yourself go behind the curtain and judge beer, because it will make your choices way more informed on how you get into competition. There's a lot of brewers or a lot of beers that end up on the table and you're like, man, how did this get here? And I truly think a lot of it is they just don't know. And so, taking that advice and making sure you're putting in the right category, making sure you're being honest with yourself, and then you yourself getting involved are going to be the two things that really set yourself up for success. If you look at some of the most medal winning brewers, oftentimes there's a correlation to them judging. Maybe not all the time. Maybe they don't have as much time as they used to, but Matt Brindleson of Firestone Walker, Tanya Cornett, the folks over at New Belgium, like there's a lot of these folks that we see time and time again at the judging tables. They also happen to be the people who are winning. And I think it's having that kind of behind the scenes look, and then really that like honest ability to evaluate their beers and decide, should this go to competition or not?
Yeah, that appreciation for both sides of the spectrum, right? Yeah, that's a really, really valid point. Love it. So, okay, Josh, we've been rapping for nearly 40 minutes. This time has flown by, but I get a feeling that some of the people listening would kick me if I don't ask you about trends and things that you can see emerging from US side, because we here in the UK, we love what we do, but we've always got one eye on the US to see what we can bring in and what we can like upgrade our own offering with. So what can you share with us?
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about the trends is, I think oftentimes we feel like style guidelines drive trends, or what's being entered in competition drives trends. But I think it's quite the opposite. I think brewers drive trends. I think, if you are doing something unique, smoothie sour didn't exist until brewers were making it and started putting it in competition in places it should have never been. And ultimately it was like, okay, we need a category for this. So now smoothie sour exists. Now pastry stout exists. So, I think actually the judging is really behind the 8-ball. It takes a lot of time to evaluate or to build a new style, because you've got to figure out, how do we write this up? How is it different from what already exists? Does it need to exist? And so there's all these things. But that being said, I've been lucky enough to judge a lot of experimental categories. Now not being, with a brewery that's entering competition, I get all these weird categories that a lot of brewers tend to enter in, can't judge. And so on the experimental side, I think we're seeing a lot of really unique culinary ingredients, everything from, spices, turmeric, rosemary, like really high quality spices, exotic fruits, the Brazilians with Catarina sour. I would love to get down and judge in Brazil, because I've heard that there are fruits that like I've never even seen or heard of. And so to be able to taste those. But again, I think what we're seeing is just like, everyone's taking inspiration from everybody. And it's whatever we can get our hands on, we're willing to put in beer for the most part. And so, yeah, I think a lot of the trends are just pushing the boundaries. And then the other thing I think that we're seeing that maybe isn't at the judging table as much, just because we don't have the branding. But like the light, low cal, contemporary styles is often what it's called in the style guidelines. But those are typically like low cal, low carb, for lack of better terms, diet beers. But we're seeing those categories, more and more people are entering them, which, tells us that more and more people are producing them. And I think that's part of the greater trend of just what we're seeing from consumers asking for. And, sometimes those aren't the most exciting things to get at the judging table. When you've got 15 contemporary light lagers in front of you, you're like, wow, these are all strikingly the same, but the quality of them has all gone up. So I guess the two things I would take away is people are pushing boundaries. I don't think trends start at the judging table. I think they actually start at the brewing level and then get pushed to the judging table. So nothing's off limits. And then, pushing those boundaries is good. And I think if you're making something, then you don't find a category for it, like reach out to organizers and say like, hey, let's explore this. Because I think the faster that we can get caught up, the better it will be for the consumer. We can write something down and kind of, for lack of better term, standardize it.
Yeah. It goes back to what you're saying about, brewers trying to find a category which has limited entries. Like, it's even better if you can be in a category of one and no one's ever done it before. You're like, okay, I'm a shoo-in. I'm going to win this one.
Or at least or like, hey, we're bringing this to the masses, right? Like, you've got something. And again, like, I think brewers, I think consumers don't necessarily always realize this, but like brewers are pretty collaborative. Like, there's not a lot of like secrets in the brewing world. Recipes aren't written in stone. And so it's like, there's always things changing. I could give you my beer recipe and you would still make a different beer with the exact same recipe. And so, we like to share techniques and things like that. And so again, I think brewers coming together to say, hey, we want competition to catch up, it'll be a rising tide. And so I think there's value to that.
Josh, man, thank you so much for your time this morning. I know it is silly o'clock that you agreed to jump on the call. So, dude, hats off to you. If people love what you're talking about, want to hear more from you, see where you are, find you, reach out to you, where can they connect with you, man?
Yeah, LinkedIn's probably the best place. I think we're live on LinkedIn right now. So feel free to send me a connection request, Josh Lindsay. I am on Instagram, but Tim, I know we were talking a little bit earlier. I've been pretty bad at posting, but my Instagram is better. I don't actually know. To be honest, I think it's brew.ed_Josh Lindsay. That tells you how long it's been since I posted, but you can hit me up on there. Tim, I think you started our conversation on there. So I read messages. I talk to people all the time. I just don't post very much. So kind of boring there, but yeah, brew.ed_Josh Lindsay. And yeah, I mean, I love to chop it up with anybody. I have, really no secrets. So if there's anything I can do to help somebody to kind of be a sounding board or share my insight, happy to do so. And, at the end of the day, I love this industry. I think it's one of the best industries that's existed. And I think now is a better time than any time in history to be a beer drinker. And so everybody that is, responsible for making these beverages should be celebrated, because that you got us to where we are today. And I think this industry is going to continue to grow and continue to do great things.
What a positive point to finish it on, Josh. Thank you, my man. You rock. Everyone who's watched, everyone who's listening or will listen, thank you. It's always appreciated. Have a great day, guys. Rock on.
Cheers.